Chapter 1. New Members' Arrival. The parish hall of St. Mary Mead was filled with the gentle clicking of knitting needles and the soft murmur of conversation that Thursday afternoon. The members of the village knitting circle had gathered as they had done every week for longer than most could remember, their chairs arranged in a comfortable semicircle near the tall windows that overlooked the vicarage garden. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual spot, her keen blue eyes observing the assembly over the delicate lacework emerging from her needles. The atmosphere today held an unusual charge of anticipation, for they were expecting a new member, Mrs. Eleanor Harrington, who had recently taken up residence at Thornfield Cottage. "I wonder what she'll be like," murmured Miss Weatherby, the doctor's spinster sister, adjusting her spectacles. "One hears such varied reports about newcomers these days." "My dear, she seems perfectly respectable," replied Mrs. Price, the postmistress, who prided herself on knowing everything about everyone in the village. "A widow, I understand. Quite well dressed when I saw her at the shops yesterday." The door opened, and heads turned as a slender woman of perhaps 50 entered the room. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her dove-grey dress impeccably tailored, her silver hair arranged in an elegant chignon. In her hands was a tapestry bag, from which protruded several skeins of fine wool. "Ah, Mrs. Harrington!" exclaimed Mrs. Partridge, the vicar's wife, rising to make the introductions. "How lovely that you could join us. Ladies, this is Mrs. Eleanor Harrington, our newest resident at Thornfield Cottage." As greetings were exchanged and tea poured, Miss Marple observed the newcomer with her habitual attention to detail. Mrs. Harrington's hands, she noted, were those of an experienced knitter. The fingers moved with practiced ease as she withdrew her needles and wool from her bag. Yet there was something in the way she held herself, a certain guardedness in her pleasant smile, that suggested layers beneath the polished surface. "What a beautiful pattern you're working on," commented Mrs. Dolly Bantry, leaning forward to examine Mrs. Harrington's knitting. "I don't believe I've seen anything quite like it before." "Oh, it's just something I learned years ago," Mrs. Harrington replied, her voice cultured but carefully neutral. "An old family pattern, you might say." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. The pattern was indeed unusual, complex and intricate, with a sequence of stitches that seemed almost mathematical in their precision. She had encountered many knitting patterns in her long life, but this one struck her as peculiarly distinctive. "And where did you live before coming to St. Mary Mead?" inquired Miss Hargreaves, the bank manager's wife, with the direct curiosity that small villages permitted. "Oh, here and there," Mrs. Harrington answered vaguely, her fingers never faltering in their work. "My late husband's work required us to move frequently. I thought it time to settle somewhere peaceful." Miss Marple noticed how skillfully the question had been deflected, answered yet not answered, revealing nothing while appearing to be forthcoming. It was a technique she had observed before, though usually in quite different circumstances. The conversation drifted to village matters, the upcoming church fete, the new roses in the vicarage garden, young Tommy Roberts' latest mischief. Mrs. Harrington listened attentively, contributing little but seeming to absorb every detail. When asked about her own gardening plans for Thornfield Cottage, she mentioned an interest in heritage roses, which launched Mrs. Bantry into an enthusiastic discourse on the subject. "You know," Mrs. Bantry said suddenly, pausing in her description of the Bourbon roses at Gossington Hall, "my husband believes he's seen you before somewhere. Colonel Bantry, you know. He has quite a memory for faces, though he couldn't quite place where." For the briefest moment, Mrs. Harrington's hands stilled. The pause was almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple caught it. that tiny hesitation before the needles resumed their steady rhythm. "How interesting," Mrs. Harrington replied smoothly. "I suppose I have one of those faces. People often think they recognize me." The meeting continued pleasantly enough, but Miss Marple sensed an underlying current of unease in their new member. It manifested in small ways: the slight tension in her shoulders when personal questions arose, the careful way she positioned herself to observe everyone in the room, the practiced manner in which she steered conversations away from herself. As the clock struck 4 and the ladies began to pack away their work, Miss Marple lingered to help Mrs. Partridge tidy the wool supplies. It was then she noticed a small notebook lying partially hidden beneath a chair. It must have fallen from Mrs. Harrington's bag when she retrieved her knitting. The notebook was worn leather, its pages filled with what appeared to be— Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and looked more closely. Not knitting patterns, as one might expect, but rows of numbers and letters arranged in peculiar sequences. Before she could examine it further, she heard footsteps approaching. "Oh, my notebook!" Mrs. Harrington stood in the doorway, a flash of genuine anxiety crossing her features. "I came back for it. So careless of me." "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied, handing it over with her gentle smile. "We all misplace things from time to time." Mrs. Harrington accepted the notebook with visible relief, though her fingers tightened around it possessively. "Thank you, Miss Marple. You're very kind." After she had gone, Miss Marple stood thoughtfully by the window, watching Mrs. Harrington's retreating figure. There was more to their new member than met the eye, of that she was certain. The question was, what exactly was Mrs. Eleanor Harrington hiding? Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Bantry, his military bearings still evident despite his years of retirement. He had come to collect his wife, but his expression was troubled. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "that woman who just left, Mrs. Harrington, isn't it? I've been puzzling over it all afternoon, and now I remember where I saw her before." Miss Marple turned to face him, her blue eyes alert. "Indeed, Colonel. At my club in London, about 5 years ago, there was a photograph in the members' gallery, charity function of some sort. She was standing next to Major Richardson." He paused significantly. "You remember the Richardson case, I suppose? The man who was convicted of passing government secrets during the war?" "I remember it very well," Miss Marple replied quietly. "Thought you might." The Colonel nodded grimly. "Question is, what's she doing in St. Mary Mead?" As Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, she reflected on the afternoon's events. A new resident with a carefully constructed privacy, unusual knitting patterns, a notebook filled with codes, and now a connection to a convicted spy. In her experience, such coincidences rarely occurred without purpose. She paused at her garden gate, looking back toward the village. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Eleanor Harrington was settling into Thornfield Cottage, perhaps believing her secrets were safe. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that secrets, like dropped stitches in knitting, had a way of unraveling when least expected. And she had always been rather good at following loose threads to their source. Chapter 2. Strange Patterns Discovered. The following Thursday afternoon, Miss Marple arrived at the parish hall earlier than usual, her knitting basket containing not only her current project, a cardigan for her great-nephew, but also several reference books on historical knitting techniques that she had borrowed from the county library. Her conversation with Colonel Bantry had left her curious about certain aspects of Mrs. Harrington's unusual knitting pattern. As the other members of the circle arrived, Miss Marple observed that Mrs. Harrington seemed more at ease than during her first visit, though she still positioned herself with her back to the wall, affording a clear view of both the door and windows. The mysterious woman was working on what appeared to be a Fair Isle sweater, its pattern even more complex than the piece she had brought the previous week. "How lovely!" exclaimed Mrs. Bantry, settling into her chair. "I've always admired Fair Isle work, but I've never had the patience for it myself." Mrs. Harrington smiled politely. "It requires concentration, certainly. I find the repetitive nature of the pattern quite soothing." Miss Marple's eyes, however, were focused not on the overall design, but on certain peculiarities within it. The color changes seemed to follow no traditional Fair Isle pattern she recognized, and there were deliberate dropped stitches that appeared too regular to be accidental. She had seen something similar before, many years ago, though she couldn't quite place where. "My dear Mrs. Harrington," ventured the vicar's wife, leaning closer to examine the work. "What an intricate design! Might I ask where you learned such an unusual interpretation of Fair Isle?" For a moment, Mrs. Harrington's hands stilled. "Oh, it's just something I've adapted over the years. I like to experiment with traditional patterns." "Speaking of experiments," Miss Weatherby interjected, "did you hear about old Mr. Pemberton? He was quite upset yesterday, claiming someone had been photographing his cottage. Apparently it was once part of the old manor estate during the war." "How curious," Mrs. Harrington murmured, her attention seemingly fixed on her knitting. "I suppose many of the older properties in the village have interesting histories." "Oh, yes," Mrs. Price chimed in, always eager to share village gossip. "The manor was quite important during the war. Some sort of communications center, I believe. All very hush-hush at the time. My mother used to work in the kitchens there and said there were rooms she was never allowed to enter." Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Harrington's knitting needles moving more rapidly, though her expression remained carefully neutral. "Several young women from the village worked there as clerks," added Miss Hargreaves. "Terrible tragedy when one of them died. Catherine Bell, wasn't it? Fell down those steep stone steps at the back of the manor. Such a promising girl, too." "When did this happen?" Mrs. Harrington asked, her voice steady, but her knuckles whitening slightly around her needles. "Oh, 1944, I believe," Miss Margreaves replied. "Just before the end of the war. Poor thing was only 22. The conversation drifted to other topics, but Miss Marple observed that Mrs. Harrington's Fair Isle project had been hastily folded and tucked away, replaced by a simple scarf pattern that required less concentration. After the meeting, as Miss Marple walked home through the village, she made a detour to the library. The elderly librarian, Miss Jenkins, greeted her warmly. "Back so soon, Miss Marple? Did you find those knitting books helpful?" "Indeed, though I wondered if you might have anything on wartime crafts, specifically about encoding messages in handwork." Miss Jenkins's eyes brightened with interest. "How fascinating! Let me check our military history section." 20 minutes later, Miss Marple sat at a reading table with a slim volume entitled "Hidden in Plain Sight: Covert Communications in Domestic Crafts." One chapter particularly caught her attention: "The Belgian Resistance and the Knitted Code." It described how resistance members had embedded information in knitting patterns, troop movements, supply routes, and other intelligence, all disguised as innocent domestic handiwork. The key to the system, the author explained, lay in deliberate irregularities: dropped stitches representing dots, purled stitches among knit ones indicating dashes, and color changes marking the boundaries between words or phrases. Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Harrington's Fair Isle pattern, with its seemingly random color changes and precisely placed errors. She turned to another chapter discussing similar techniques used by British intelligence during the war. That evening, she received an unexpected visit from Mrs. Price, who arrived breathless with news. "Oh, Miss Marple, you'll never guess. I saw Mrs. Harrington in the churchyard this afternoon, well after dark it was, and she was taking photographs of the old graves. When she saw me, she said she was interested in local history, but it seemed odd, don't you think?" "Which graves, specifically?" Miss Marple asked, pouring her visitor a cup of tea. "The ones near the old yew tree, you know, where the Bells are buried." She seemed particularly interested in Catherine Bell's stone. After Mrs. Price departed, Miss Marple sat in thoughtful silence. Catherine Bell, the young woman who had died at the manor during the war, Mrs. Harrington's interest in the old communications centre, the encoded knitting patterns, Colonel Bantry's recollection of seeing her with Major Richardson, the convicted spy. The following morning, Miss Marple called on Mrs. Bantry at Gossington Hall. "Jane, how lovely. I was just about to telephone you. The most extraordinary thing. I was sorting through some of Arthur's old photograph albums last night, and found something rather curious." She led Miss Marple to the morning room, where several albums lay open on a table. "Here." Mrs. Bantry pointed to a faded photograph. "This was taken at a regimental reunion in 1942. That's Catherine Bell, isn't it? And look who's standing behind her." Miss Marple peered at the photograph. There was Catherine Bell, young and smiling, wearing the uniform of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. Behind her stood a tall officer whose face was turned partially away from the camera. "I can't quite make out his features," Miss Marple murmured. "No, but look at his insignia. Arthur always said those intelligence corps badges were distinctive. And see the woman next to Catherine? She's holding some sort of notebook. Doesn't it look like the one Mrs. Harrington dropped at the knitting circle?" Miss Marple studied the photograph more carefully. The notebook in the image did indeed bear a striking resemblance to the one she had briefly examined. "Dolly," she said quietly, "would you mind if I borrowed this photograph? I'd like to show it to someone." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Miss Jenkins at the library again, this time to examine the archive of local newspapers from 1944. The report of Catherine Bell's death was brief. "Local girl dies in tragic accident." The article mentioned that Catherine had been employed at the manor, but provided few details about the circumstances of her death. As she was preparing to leave, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Harrington entering the library. She appeared to be heading for the local history section, but stopped abruptly when she saw Miss Marple. "Doing some research, Miss Marple?" she asked, her tone carefully casual. "Oh, just satisfying an old woman's curiosity about village history," Miss Marple replied. "I find the war years particularly interesting, don't you? So many secrets and stories that have never been fully told." Mrs. Harrington's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes, I suppose that's true. Though sometimes the past is best left undisturbed." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed amiably, "though in my experience the past has a way of making itself known, whether we wish it or not." That evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, examining the borrowed photograph under a magnifying glass. She had also retrieved her knitting basket and was studying the pattern she had copied from memory after observing Mrs. Harrington's work. The photograph yielded an interesting detail. Catherine Bell's notebook, visible in the image, bore the same distinctive leather binding as the one Mrs. Harrington had dropped. More intriguingly, Catherine's fingers rested on the notebook in what appeared to be a deliberate pose, her index finger pointing to a specific pattern of marks on the cover. Miss Marple then turned her attention to the knitting pattern she had sketched. Using the information from the library book on wartime codes, She began to decipher the deliberate mistakes in Mrs. Harrington's Fair Isle design. It was painstaking work, but gradually a pattern emerged, not of words, but of numbers and coordinates. Just then, her telephone rang. It was Colonel Bantry. "Miss Marple, thought you should know. I've seen our mysterious Mrs. Harrington again. She was at the Old Manor gates this evening, taking more photographs, and she wasn't alone. There was an elderly chap with her. Looked familiar, but I couldn't place him. They seemed to be measuring something." After ending the call, Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her keen mind working through the accumulating evidence. Whatever Mrs. Harrington was searching for, it was connected to Catherine Bell, the wartime intelligence operations at the manor, and quite possibly to the convicted spy, Major Richardson. The question now was Mrs. Harrington continuing some long-dormant espionage activity? Or was she perhaps trying to uncover a truth that had been buried for decades? And what role had Catherine Bell played in events that had led to her untimely death? As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple noticed something she had previously overlooked in the photograph. Barely visible in the background was another figure, a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Catherine Bell. Sisters, perhaps? And if so, could this be the key to understanding Mrs. Harrington's true identity and purpose in St. Mary Mead? One thing was certain. The neat stitches and careful patterns of the village knitting circle were concealing a far more complex design than anyone had imagined. Chapter 3. The Anonymous Letter. The morning post brought an unusual delivery to the village post office. Mrs. Price, sorting through the mail with her customary efficiency, paused when she encountered an envelope addressed to herself in block capitals. The postmark was local, but there was no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing a typewritten message. "The woman calling herself Eleanor Harrington is not who she claims to be. Her presence in St. Mary Mead poses a danger to this community. Investigate her past before it is too late." By tea time, news of the anonymous letter had spread through the village like wildfire. Mrs. Price, despite her position requiring discretion, had been unable to contain such dramatic information. The knitting circle, meeting for an extraordinary session that evening, buzzed with speculation. "I always thought there was something odd about her," declared Miss Weatherby, her needles clicking disapprovingly. "The way she deflects personal questions, it's simply not natural." Now, cautioned Mrs. Partridge, though her own expression betrayed concern. "We mustn't judge hastily. Anonymous letters are often the work of malicious minds." Miss Marple observed the discussion with quiet interest, noting that Mrs. Harrington's usual chair remained empty. The woman had sent word that she was indisposed, a diplomatic illness, perhaps, in light of the day's revelations. "Has anyone actually seen Mrs. Harrington today?" asked Mrs. Bantry. "I glimpsed her this morning," replied Miss Hargreaves. "She was in her garden, looking quite pale. When I called out a greeting, she barely acknowledged me before hurrying inside." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of P.C. Gibbs, the village constable, his helmet tucked respectfully under his arm. "Ladies, I'm sorry to disturb your meeting, but I'm making inquiries about this anonymous letter business. Has anyone noticed anything suspicious about Mrs. Harrington? Anything at all?" The floodgates opened. Reports poured forth of late-night wanderings, mysterious photography sessions, and evasive behavior. Miss Marple listened carefully, separating fact from embellished fiction, while keeping her own observations to herself. Later that evening, she received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Harrington stood on her doorstep, her usually composed features drawn with worry. "Miss Marple, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I need to speak with someone sensible. May I come in?" "Of course, my dear." Miss Marple led her visitor to the cozy sitting room. You look troubled. Mrs. Harrington accepted a cup of tea with trembling hands. I suppose you've heard about the letter. The whole village is talking about it. People are crossing the street to avoid me, and someone threw a stone through my kitchen window this afternoon. Dear me, how distressing. Have you reported it to the police? What's the point? They clearly suspect me of, well, I don't know what exactly. Miss Marple, I know I've been reserved about my past, but that's simply my nature. I came to St. Mary Mead seeking peace, not persecution. Miss Marple studied her visitor carefully. Perhaps if you were more forthcoming about your background, it might allay people's suspicions. I wish it were that simple. Mrs. Harrington set down her teacup. There are aspects of my past that I cannot discuss, not because they're shameful, but because they involve others who might be harmed by exposure. I'm conducting historical research, nothing more sinister than that. Research concerning Catherine Bell? Mrs. Harrington's eyes widened. You know about that? My dear, very little escapes notice in a village like St. Mary Mead. You've been photographing her grave, making inquiries about the old manor. It's natural that people would be curious. Catherine Bell was connected to my family, Mrs. Harrington said carefully. I'm trying to understand certain events that occurred during the war, events that have been misrepresented in official records. Before Miss Marple could respond, they were interrupted by urgent knocking. Colonel Bantry stood at the door, his face grave. Sorry to barge in, Miss Marple, but I thought you should know immediately. Someone's broken into Thornfield Cottage. Mrs. Harrington's home has been ransacked. Mrs. Harrington rose abruptly, nearly upsetting her tea. What? But I've only been gone an hour. They hurried to Thornfield Cottage, where P.C. Gibbs was already examining the scene. The usually neat sitting room was in chaos. Drawers pulled out, cushions slashed, books strewn across the floor. Anything missing, madam? P.C. Gibbs asked. Mrs. Harrington surveyed the damage, her face pale but controlled. My jewelry box has been emptied, though it contained nothing valuable. Some cash from the desk drawer, and... She hesitated. An old photograph album. Anything else? I'll need to check more thoroughly, but those seem to be the only things taken. Miss Marple noticed a curious detail. While the room had been thoroughly searched, certain areas showed more disturbance than others. The bookshelf containing local history volumes had been particularly ravaged, and the escritoire where Mrs. Harrington had been seen writing had been forced open. Later, after the police had completed their initial investigation, Mrs. Harrington confided in Miss Marple. There was something else taken. A book of knitting patterns that belonged to my mother. It's of no monetary value, but it held great sentimental importance. An unusual thing for a burglar to take, Miss Marple observed. Yes, isn't it? Mrs. Harrington's voice was barely above a whisper. Almost as if they knew exactly what to look for. The next morning brought another development. A second anonymous letter arrived, this time addressed to the vicar. Eleanor Harrington was involved in Catherine Bell's death. She has returned to destroy evidence of her crime. The truth lies buried with the dead. The vicar, disturbed by the accusation, consulted with Miss Marple. This is becoming quite serious, Jane. Should we inform the police about these allegations? I think, Vicar, that we should proceed with caution. Anonymous letters often reveal more about the writer than the subject. The question is, who benefits from driving Mrs. Harrington away? That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to her old friend Sir Henry Clithering, formerly of Scotland Yard, who was staying at the nearby Melchett Hall. Henry, I wonder if you might make some discreet inquiries about a Mrs. Eleanor Harrington, and perhaps about the death of a young woman named Catherine Bell in 1944. Sir Henry regarded her shrewdly. You've got that look in your eye, Jane. What have you stumbled upon this time? Miss Marple outlined the recent events, including Colonel Bantry's recollection of seeing Mrs. Harrington with Major Richardson, the convicted spy. Richardson? Sir Henry mused. I remember that case. Always felt there was something off about it. The evidence was circumstantial, and Richardson maintained his innocence to the end. Died in prison 3 years ago, still protesting he'd been framed. Framed by whom? That was never established. But there were rumors of corruption at high levels. Some documents went missing during the trial. Documents that Richardson claimed would have exonerated him. That evening, Miss Marple observed Mrs. Harrington making another visit to the churchyard. This time, however, she was not alone. An elderly man accompanied her, the same man Colonel Bantry had mentioned seeing at the manor gates. Miss Marple recognized him as Mr. Fredericks, a retired librarian from the county archives. Hidden behind the ancient yew tree, Miss Marple watched as Mrs. Harrington and Mr. Fredericks examined Catherine Bell's gravestone with particular attention. They appeared to be taking measurements, and Mr. Fredericks was consulting what looked like old architectural drawings. The next Thursday, the knitting circle convened in an atmosphere of palpable tension. Mrs. Harrington arrived late, her chin held high despite the cool reception from several members. I believe, she announced, taking her seat, that someone in this room has been writing anonymous letters about me. I want you all to know that I have engaged a solicitor and will pursue legal action if this harassment continues. The shocked silence was broken by Miss Weatherby's indignant gasp. How dare you accuse us? I accuse no one specifically, Mrs. Harrington replied evenly. I merely state facts. These letters contain information known only to members of this circle. As the meeting progressed uncomfortably, Miss Marple noticed something interesting. While Mrs. Harrington worked on a new project, a simple Afghan this time, she occasionally glanced at specific spots around the room. The loose floorboard near the window, a particular section of wainscoting, the old cupboard where spare wool was stored. After the meeting, as the ladies dispersed, Miss Marple lingered. She approached the old cupboard and ran her fingers along its edges. The wood was scuffed in places, as if it had been opened frequently and hastily. Looking for something, Miss Marple? She turned to find Mrs. Harrington watching her. Just tidying up, my dear. These old cupboards collect such dust. Mrs. Harrington stepped closer. You're different from the others, aren't you? You observe, but you don't rush to judgment. I've learned that things are rarely what they seem at first glance. Then perhaps you'll understand when I tell you that I'm running out of time. Someone knows why I'm here, and they're trying to stop me from finding what I seek. That night, Miss Marple received a late telephone call from Sir Henry. Jane, I've made those inquiries. Eleanor Harrington's background checks out perfectly, too perfectly, if you take my meaning. It's as if someone constructed an impeccable but entirely fictional history. The real Eleanor Harrington, widow of Commander Harrington, died in a car accident in Scotland 2 years ago. After ending the call, Miss Marple sat in thoughtful silence. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though the complete picture remained frustratingly unclear. An imposter using a dead woman's identity, anonymous letters designed to drive her away, a decades-old death shrouded in mystery, and a connection to espionage. Just before retiring, she heard footsteps on her garden path. Looking out, she saw a figure placing something on her doorstep before hurrying away. When she opened the door, she found a ball of wool, the same distinctive shade Mrs. Harrington had been using, wrapped around a tarnished military button. Attached was a note. Some patterns reveal themselves only when viewed from the right angle. The truth is hidden where the threads converge. Miss Marple picked up the button, examining it under the hall light. It bore the insignia of the Intelligence Corps, the same insignia visible in the photograph of the officer standing behind Catherine Bell. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple reflected on the evening's events. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a visit to Catherine Bell's surviving sister. It was time to unravel this tangled skein from its beginning, and she suspected that the Bell family held the key to understanding not just Mrs. Harrington's true identity, but also the dangerous game being played out in their quiet village. Chapter 4. Village Rumours. The village of St. Mary Mead had divided itself into two distinct camps. There were those who believed Mrs. Harrington to be a dangerous infiltrator with sinister motives, and those who saw her as the victim of a malicious campaign. The morning gatherings at the bakery and afternoon teas had become battlegrounds of opinion. "I saw her myself, creeping about the churchyard after midnight," insisted Mrs. Pike, the baker's wife, to anyone who would listen. "Up to no good, mark my words." "Nonsense," retorted Miss Hartwell, the retired schoolmistress. "The poor woman is being hounded by vicious gossip. It's disgraceful." Miss Marple, maintaining her customary neutrality, listened to both sides while pursuing her own quiet investigation. That morning, she called upon Dorothy Bell, Catherine's elderly sister, who lived in a small cottage near the village green. Miss Bell, a frail woman in her late 70s, welcomed Miss Marple into a sitting room filled with photographs and memories. Among them, prominently displayed, was a portrait of Catherine in her WAAF uniform. "She was so proud to serve," Miss Bell said softly, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Said she was doing important work at the manor, though she couldn't tell me exactly what." "It must have been a terrible shock when she died," Miss Marple said gently. "It was, and I've never believed it was an accident. Catherine was careful, methodical. She wouldn't have fallen down those steps. She knew them too well." Miss Bell's voice hardened. "But nobody would listen to me. They said I was overwrought with grief." "Did she seem troubled in the weeks before her death?" "Very much so. She kept talking about patterns that didn't match, numbers that didn't add up. I thought she meant her clerical work, but now I wonder—" Miss Bell reached for a box on the side table. "I kept all her things. There isn't much. They returned her personal effects, but not her work materials. Those were classified, they said." She handed Miss Marple a small diary. "She wrote in code sometimes, a game we played as children. I could never decipher this last entry." Miss Marple examined the diary. The final entry was indeed in code, a series of knitting abbreviations, K2, P1, YO, K2, together. Her eyes widened as she recognized the pattern. It was identical to sequences she'd observed in Mrs. Harrington's work. "Miss Bell, did Catherine ever mention someone trying to misuse the coding systems at the manor?" "Not directly, but she did say once that someone was pulling wool over everyone's eyes. I thought it was just an expression, but Catherine was very precise with language." After leaving Miss Bell, Miss Marple made her way to the village library, where she found Sir Henry Clithering waiting for her. "Jane, I've uncovered something rather interesting," he said without preamble. "That military button you showed me, it belonged to a Lieutenant Colonel James Hargreaves. He served at the manor during the war, overseeing intelligence operations." "And where is Lieutenant Colonel Hargreaves now?" "That's just it. He's now Sir James Hargreaves, recently appointed to the Foreign Office. Quite a meteoric rise after the war. And here's something curious. He was the senior investigating officer in the Richardson case. Miss Marple considered this information. The same man who oversaw operations at the manor investigated Richardson, and whose button has mysteriously appeared on my doorstep. How very interesting. Meanwhile, the village tensions reached a new peak when a third anonymous letter appeared, this time posted on the church notice board for all to see. The truth about Catherine Bell's murder will be revealed. Ask Eleanor Harrington about the cipher keys. Ask her about the night of October 15th, 1944. The vicar removed the letter immediately, but not before half the village had seen it. The reaction was explosive. That afternoon, a delegation of concerned citizens, led by Mrs. Pike and Miss Weatherby, marched to Thornfield Cottage to confront Mrs. Harrington. They found her in the garden, calmly tending her roses. "We demand to know the truth," Mrs. Pike announced dramatically. "What is your connection to Catherine Bell's death?" Mrs. Harrington straightened, her gardening gloves still on. "I have no connection to her death. I am trying to uncover the truth about it." "Then why conceal your identity?" challenged Miss Weatherby. "Because," Mrs. Harrington replied quietly, "the person responsible for Catherine's death is still alive, still powerful, and still dangerous." This revelation stunned the group into silence. It was broken by the arrival of Colonel Bantry, looking troubled. "I've just come from the manor," he announced. "Someone's been digging in the old rose garden, the one that was paved over after the war. Mrs. Bentley is quite upset about the damage to her lawn." Mrs. Harrington's face paled visibly. "The rose garden? Are you certain?" "Quite certain. Happened last night, apparently. Rather odd, what?" As the delegation dispersed, Miss Marple approached Mrs. Harrington. "My dear, I think it's time we had a frank conversation." They retreated to Thornfield Cottage, where Mrs. Harrington poured tea with unsteady hands. "You're not Eleanor Harrington," Miss Marple stated simply. "No, I'm not." The woman's shoulders sagged slightly. "But I can't tell you who I really am. Not yet. Lives depend on maintaining this fiction a while longer." "Including your own?" "Especially my own. Miss Marple, I'm very close to finding something that was hidden here during the war, something that will prove Major Richardson's innocence and expose the real traitor." "The cipher keys Catherine mentioned?" Mrs. Harrington looked startled. "You know about those?" "I've been doing my own investigating. Catherine Bell kept a diary. Her sister has it." "Dorothy still has it?" "I wasn't sure. I haven't dared approach her directly. Are you, by any chance, related to Catherine?" Mrs. Harrington hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Catherine was my aunt. My mother was her younger sister, Margaret. She was only 16 when Catherine died, away at school. The family was told it was an accident, case closed, but my mother never believed it." "And the knitting patterns?" "Catherine was brilliant with codes. She created a system of hiding information in knitting patterns, a backup in case official channels were compromised. My mother spent years trying to decode Catherine's final message. She passed the quest on to me when she died." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the window they could see Mr. Fredericks hurrying up the path, clearly agitated. "We must leave immediately," he said, as soon as Mrs. Harrington opened the door. "I've just received word. Sir James Hargreaves is coming to St. Mary Mead. He'll be here by evening." Mrs. Harrington's face drained of colour. "How did he find out?" "The anonymous letters, the inquiries. Someone's been feeding him information. We're out of time." After they left, Miss Marple sat thoughtfully in her garden. The pattern was becoming clearer. Sir James Hargreaves, the former lieutenant colonel who had overseen the manor's intelligence operations, who had investigated Richardson, and who had apparently risen to power in the years since, was at the centre of this web. That evening, she received another visit from Colonel Bantry. His normally florid face was pale with concern. "Miss Marple, I've just had the most extraordinary conversation with my old friend Brigadier Focas. He served with Hargreaves during the war. Says the man was brilliant, but ruthless. There were rumors about missing supplies, black market dealings, but nothing was ever proved." "And Catherine Bell worked in his department?" "Exactly. And here's the thing. Folks says there was talk of her discovering something just before she died. Documents went missing, security protocols were changed overnight. It was all hushed up as wartime necessity." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Colonel, I believe we are dealing with something far more serious than village gossip. A young woman was murdered to protect a secret, an innocent man was framed and died in prison, and now someone is trying very hard to prevent that secret from being revealed." As darkness fell over St. Mary Mead, a large black car was seen driving through the village. It stopped briefly at the inn, where a distinguished-looking man in his 70s registered under the name of Smith. But Miss Marple, watching from her garden gate, recognized the military bearing, the authoritative manner. Sir James Hargreaves had arrived in St. Mary Mead. That night, unable to sleep, Miss Marple reviewed everything she had learned. The cipher keys Catherine had mentioned were crucial. They would decode the evidence she had gathered about Hargreaves's corruption. The rose garden at the manor, hastily paved over after Catherine's death, might be where she had hidden them. The knitting patterns were Catherine's backup system, her way of preserving the truth in case something happened to her. A soft sound in her garden made her look out the window. A figure was placing something on her doorstep, not the mysterious gift-giver this time, but Mrs. Harrington herself. Miss Marple opened the door to find an envelope containing a single sheet of paper. On it was a knitting pattern, the same Fair Isle design Mrs. Harrington had been working on. But now, with her understanding of the code, Miss Marple could read its message. "The truth lies beneath the roses. October 15th, 1944. Trust no one in authority. K.B." As she closed her door, Miss Marple saw lights still burning at the inn. Sir James Hargreaves was awake, planning his next move. The game, as they say, was afoot, and Miss Marple suspected that the next 24 hours would determine whether a decades-old injustice would finally be corrected, or buried forever beneath layers of lies and official secrets. Chapter 5. Miss Marple's Deduction. The morning after Sir James Hargreaves's arrival brought an unseasonable fog to St. Mary Mead, shrouding the village in an appropriate atmosphere of mystery. Miss Marple, despite having slept little, was up early, examining the decoded message from Catherine Bell's knitting pattern once more. The reference to October 15th, 1944, was particularly significant. It was the night before Catherine's death. Armed with a basket of freshly baked scones as a pretext, Miss Marple called at Thornfield Cottage. Mrs. Harrington, or rather Margaret Bell, as Miss Marple now knew her to be, answered the door with dark circles under her eyes. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting—" "My dear, I thought you might need some sustenance. May I come in?" Once inside, Miss Marple came straight to the point. "I decoded the message you left. The cipher keys are hidden beneath the rose garden at the manor, aren't they?" Margaret's eyes widened. "You understood the pattern? But how—" "Your aunt was very clever, but patterns are patterns, whether in knitting or in human behavior. I've had considerable experience with both." Miss Marple settled herself in a chair. "Now, I believe it's time you told me everything." Margaret paced the room nervously. My mother spent years trying to prove what really happened to Catherine. She discovered that Lieutenant Colonel Hargreaves had been embezzling military supplies, selling them on the black market. Catherine found evidence: invoices, shipping manifests, coded communications. She was preparing to report him when she died. And Major Richardson? He was Hargreaves's subordinate. When Catherine's evidence threatened to surface, Hargreaves planted documents implicating Richardson in espionage. It was brilliant, really. It explained away any suspicious communications as spy activity rather than black market dealings. But the cipher keys? Catherine was meticulous. She encoded all her evidence using the official cipher system, but she kept a separate record of the keys needed to decode it. She hid them the night she died, October 15th. My mother believed they were somewhere in the manor grounds. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The rose garden was paved over shortly after her death. Rather convenient timing. Exactly. But here's what's driven me to take such desperate measures. Hargreaves is about to be appointed to an even higher position. If he achieves that, any chance of justice dies with it. He'll be untouchable. Their conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking. Mr. Fredericks stood at the door, visibly shaken. He's at the manor, he reported breathlessly. Hargreaves. He's convinced Mrs. Bentley to let him inspect the grounds, says he's writing a wartime memoir and wants to revisit his old posting. Margaret grabbed her coat. We have to get there first. My dear, Miss Marple interjected calmly, rushing in would be most unwise. Sir James is clearly expecting you to make a move. We need a more subtle approach. An hour later, Miss Marple arrived at the manor with her knitting basket, accompanied by Mrs. Bantry, who had arranged with Mrs. Bentley to photograph the gardens for the upcoming flower show. Jane insisted on coming along, Mrs. Bantry explained to Mrs. Bentley. She's always been interested in the manor's history. They found Sir James Hargreaves in the library, a distinguished figure with cold grey eyes and an air of barely concealed impatience. He was examining old architectural plans of the estate. Ah, local residents, he said, with practiced charm. Perhaps you ladies remember the manor during the war? Indeed, Miss Marple replied mildly. Such a busy place then. So many young people working here. Tragic about that poor girl who fell. Hargreaves's eyes sharpened. You mean Catherine Bell? Yes, unfortunate accident. I was her commanding officer, you know. Brilliant girl, but prone to fanciful theories? Really? How interesting. I've heard she was quite methodical. Perhaps too methodical. She saw conspiracies where none existed. His tone had hardened slightly. Started making wild accusations just before her death. The stress of wartime work, I'm afraid. As they spoke, Miss Marple's keen eyes noticed something significant. Hargreaves kept glancing toward the window, overlooking what had once been the rose garden. His fingers drummed nervously on the desk whenever that area was mentioned. Later, while Mrs. Bantry distracted Hargreaves with questions about his wartime service, Miss Marple slipped away to examine the former rose garden. The area was now a plain lawn, but she noticed subtle irregularities in the ground, slight depressions that suggested something beneath had settled over the years. She was measuring these depressions with her knitting needles when she heard footsteps. Turning, she found herself face to face with Sir James Hargreaves. Losing something, Miss Marple? His voice was silk over steel. Just dropped a stitch, Sir James. At my age, one's eyes aren't what they were. Indeed. You know, it's curious how interested everyone suddenly seems to be in this old place. First that Harrington woman, now you. One might almost think there was something here worth finding. Oh, I shouldn't think so. Miss Marple replied innocently. Though gardens do hold such memories, don't they? I often think about the people who tended them, the secrets they might have shared with the flowers. Hargreaves's face darkened. Sometimes secrets are better left buried, Miss Marple. For everyone's sake. That evening, Miss Marple convened a war council at her cottage. Present were Margaret, still maintaining her identity as Mrs. Harrington, Mr. Fredericks, Colonel Bantry, and Sir Henry Clithering. The cipher keys are definitely under the rose garden, Miss Marple announced. Catherine was clever. She buried them in a pattern that mirrors her knitting code. The depressions in the lawn mark the spots. But how do we retrieve them with Hargreaves watching? Margaret asked desperately. We don't, Miss Marple replied. We let him retrieve them for us. She outlined her plan. It was audacious, relying on Hargreaves's arrogance and his ignorance of how much they knew. That night, Miss Marple placed an anonymous note at the inn. The Bell girl's evidence is beneath the third rose from the north wall. Midnight. Come alone, or the press learns everything. From her concealed position in the manor's shrubbery, Miss Marple watched as Hargreaves, exactly at midnight, appeared with a spade. His dignified bearing was gone, replaced by the furtive movements of a desperate man. He began to dig at the specified location. What he didn't know was that Colonel Bantry and Sir Henry were photographing everything from the manor windows, while Mr. Fredericks recorded the scene on a borrowed camera. After 20 minutes of digging, Hargreaves unearthed a small metal box. His hands shook as he opened it, revealing not just cipher keys, but Catherine's detailed journal documenting his crimes. The flash of Colonel Bantry's camera caught his expression of horror perfectly. I believe those belong to the Crown. Sir Henry Clithering stepped from the shadows, his Scotland Yard credentials in hand. Sir James Hargreaves, I'm arresting you for the murder of Catherine Bell and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. Hargreaves attempted to run, but was stopped by P.C. Gibbs and Inspector Slack, whom Sir Henry had summoned earlier. As he was led away, he turned to Miss Marple with bitter recognition. You planned this entire charade? Not at all, Miss Marple replied serenely. I merely helped the truth knit itself back together. Catherine Bell was cleverer than you knew. She didn't just hide evidence, she created a pattern that would eventually reveal itself to anyone who knew how to read it. In the days that followed, the full story emerged. Catherine had indeed discovered Hargreaves's embezzlement scheme. On the night of October 15th, realizing her life was in danger, she had encoded all her evidence and hidden both the cipher keys and her journal in the rose garden using a pattern based on her knitting code. She had been killed while returning to her quarters, pushed down the stone steps by Hargreaves himself. Major Richardson was posthumously exonerated, his name cleared after decades of disgrace. The government quietly compensated his family, and the full truth about Hargreaves's corruption was revealed. Margaret Bell chose to remain in St. Mary Mead under her real name. The village, somewhat shamefaced about their treatment of her, welcomed her warmly. At the next meeting of the knitting circle, she was elected honorary secretary, and her first action was to frame her aunt's original Fair Isle pattern, the one that had contained the coded message leading to justice. You know, Mrs. Bantry remarked to Miss Marple as they sat knitting together, I always said there was something odd about that woman's patterns. Yes, dear, Miss Marple replied with a small smile. Though in my experience the most revealing patterns are often hidden in plain sight. Like dropped stitches in a piece of knitting, they may seem like mistakes, but sometimes they're the most important part of the design. Miss Marple looked across at Margaret Bell, who was teaching young Jenny Partridge a complex cable pattern. The truth, like a well-crafted piece of knitting, had finally revealed its complete design. Catherine Bell's patient code had waited decades to be understood, proving that justice, like a good pattern, could survive the passage of time. It simply needed the right person to recognize its worth and follow its threads to their proper conclusion. Chapter 6. Truth Revealed. Miss Marple arrived at Thornfield Cottage as the evening sun cast long shadows across the village green. She found Margaret Bell hastily packing her belongings, her usually composed features etched with panic. Books, papers, and half-folded clothes were scattered across the sitting room. "Miss Marple, thank goodness you've come. I don't have much time. Sir James Hargreaves knows everything. Who I am, why I'm here. He's coming to St. Mary Mead, and I fear—" "My dear," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "perhaps you should begin at the beginning. I believe I've deduced much of your story, but I'd like to hear it from you." Margaret paused in her frantic packing, then sank into a chair with a deep sigh. "You're right, of course. I owe you that much, at least." She took a steadying breath. "My real name is Margaret Bell. Catherine was my sister. My brilliant, brave older sister who was murdered 40 years ago. And you've spent your life seeking justice for her." "Yes. My mother never believed Catherine's death was an accident. On her deathbed, she made me promise to uncover the truth. She gave me Catherine's private papers, including her knitting patterns. Mother had discovered they contained coded messages, but she could never fully decipher them." Margaret moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening village. "It took me years to understand Catherine's system. She was extraordinarily clever. She'd created a code that looked like ordinary knitting instructions. Dropped stitches, yarn overs, cable crosses, each had a secret meaning. When I finally cracked it, I discovered she'd been documenting evidence of corruption." "Lieutenant Colonel Hargreaves," Miss Marple said quietly. "Yes, he was selling military supplies on the black market, using his position at the Signals Intelligence Center to cover his tracks. Catherine discovered discrepancies in the inventory records and shipping manifests. She was building a case against him when she died." "But why frame Major Richardson?" "Richardson was Hargreaves's adjutant. Catherine had confided in him about her suspicions. After murdering my sister, Hargreaves needed a scapegoat, someone to blame for any irregularities that might come to light. He fabricated evidence suggesting Richardson was passing secrets to the enemy, who would look for a black marketeer when they'd caught a spy." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And the cipher keys?" "Catherine was meticulous about security protocols. She encoded all her evidence using the official cipher system, but she kept a separate record of the keys needed to decode it. Without those keys, her evidence was meaningless, just random numbers and letters. She hid them somewhere in the manor grounds the night she was killed." "Which is why you've been searching the churchyard and photographing the manor." "I thought she might have left clues in the church registers, or hidden them in the family grave. But I was wrong." Margaret's hands clenched. Then I remembered something she'd written in one of her last letters home, about tending the roses at the manor, how she found peace there among the flowers. "The rose garden that was hastily paved over after her death." "Exactly. I believe she buried the cipher keys there, probably in some pattern that mirrors her knitting code. But now Hargreaves is coming, and—" She was interrupted by urgent knocking. Mr. Fredericks burst in without waiting for an answer. "Margaret, he's here." "Hargreaves just arrived at the village inn. He's asking questions about you, about the manor. We have to leave immediately." "No," Miss Marple said firmly. "Running now would be the worst possible thing. Sir James already knows who you are and why you're here. What he doesn't know is how much we've discovered." She turned to Mr. Fredericks. You're the former curator from the War Museum archives, aren't you? The one who authenticated Catherine's original documents? Fredericks looked startled. How did you— Never mind. Yes, I've been helping Margaret verify the evidence. Catherine Bell was a heroine whose story deserves to be told. Then help me tell it tonight, Miss Marple said. She reached for the telephone. I need to make some calls. We're going to need witnesses for what happens next. An hour later, as darkness fell over St. Mary Mead, an unusual gathering assembled at the manor. Mrs. Bentley, the current owner, had agreed to host what she thought was an historical presentation about the manor's wartime role. Present were Colonel Bantry, Sir Henry Clithering, Inspector Slack, the vicar, and several members of the village council. Sir James Hargreaves arrived last, his silver hair gleaming in the lamplight. His cold grey eyes narrowed when he saw Margaret. Well, well, he said smoothly. Miss Bell, I presume? Or do you still prefer Mrs. Harrington? My name is Margaret Bell, she replied with quiet dignity. Catherine Bell was my sister. Ah, yes, Catherine. Brilliant girl, but sadly delusional. Imagined all sorts of conspiracies where none existed. Such a tragedy when she fell down those steps. She didn't fall, Margaret said. You pushed her. Hargreaves laughed coldly. Prove it. I intend to. Margaret produced a worn notebook. This contains Catherine's encrypted records of your black market operations. Every stolen shipment, every falsified inventory, every illicit payment, all documented in her own cipher. Meaningless without the cipher keys, Hargreaves snapped. And those died with your sister. Did they? Miss Marple interjected mildly. Catherine was cleverer than you realized, Sir James. She knew her life was in danger, so she took precautions. She hid the cipher keys where she thought they'd be safe. In the rose garden she loved. Hargreaves's composure cracked slightly. The rose garden was destroyed years ago. Paved over, Miss Marple agreed. Rather hastily, as I understand it. Just days after Catherine's death. One might almost think someone wanted to bury something. This is absurd speculation, Hargreaves blustered. You have no proof of any of this. Actually, said Sir Henry Clithering, stepping forward, we do. This afternoon, with Mrs. Bentley's permission and under police supervision, we excavated portions of the old rose garden. He produced a metal box, rust-covered, but intact. We found this buried in a very specific pattern, one that matches Catherine Bell's knitting cipher. Inside were not only the cipher keys, but also Catherine's private journal detailing your crimes. Hargreaves went pale. You can't. That's impossible. Your mistake, Miss Marple said gently, was underestimating Catherine Bell. She didn't just hide evidence. She created a system that would eventually reveal itself to anyone patient enough to understand it. Her knitting patterns were a backup, you see. Even if the physical evidence was destroyed, the truth would survive, encoded in something as innocent as a Fair Isle sweater. Inspector Slack stepped forward. Sir James Hargreaves, I'm arresting you for the murder of Catherine Bell and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. As Hargreaves was led away, he turned to Margaret with bitter hatred. You've destroyed everything, my reputation, my life's work. No, Margaret replied quietly. You destroyed yourself 40 years ago when you murdered my sister. I've simply helped the truth catch up with you. Later that evening, after the police had gone and statements had been taken, a small group gathered in Miss Marple's cottage. Margaret, Mr. Fredericks, Colonel Bantry and Sir Henry sat around the fire while Miss Marple poured tea. I still don't understand, the colonel said, how you knew where to dig. The rose garden was quite large. Miss Marple smiled. Catherine left us the pattern. Her knitting cipher used specific stitches to represent coordinates. The dropped stitches in Margaret's Fair Isle design weren't mistakes. They were a map. Once I understood that, finding the cipher keys was simply a matter of translating knitting instructions into garden measurements. Remarkable, Sir Henry murmured. And Richardson? Will be posthumously exonerated, Margaret said. His family will finally have justice. The ministry has already begun the process. What will you do now? Miss Marple asked Margaret. I thought I might stay in St. Mary Mead, she replied. I've grown fond of the village, and Catherine would have liked knowing her story ended where it began. Besides, she added with a small smile, I've promised to teach the knitting circle some new patterns, ones without hidden messages. The next Thursday afternoon, the knitting circle met as usual in the parish hall. Margaret Bell, no longer hiding behind a false identity, took her place among the members. The atmosphere was warm with acceptance and tinged with admiration for her dedication to justice. I propose, announced Mrs. Bantry, that we create a commemorative piece for Catherine Bell, something that honours her memory and her cleverness. The motion was carried unanimously. It was decided they would knit a tapestry depicting the manor during wartime, with a border of roses and intricate Fair Isle patterns, a public monument to a young woman whose patience and ingenuity had finally brought a murderer to justice. As the needles began to click in familiar rhythm, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of patterns. In knitting, as in life, what appeared to be mistakes or random elements often revealed themselves as essential parts of a larger design. Catherine Bell had understood this, encoding truth in the spaces between stitches, trusting that someone, someday, would recognize the pattern and complete the work she had begun. You know, Miss Marple said to Margaret as they worked side by side, your sister reminds me of the old Greek myth about Penelope, who wove by day and unravelled by night, hiding messages in her tapestry. Except Catherine's message waited patiently for the right person to find it. Margaret smiled, her needles moving steadily. She always said that truth is like a well-made jumper. No matter how you try to unravel it, the pattern remains. You just need to know how to read it. Outside, the autumn sun slanted across St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows that would soon give way to winter. But inside the parish hall, surrounded by the gentle clicking of needles and the warmth of shared purpose, the women of the knitting circle continued their work, creating new patterns while honoring old ones. Understanding at last that sometimes the most important messages are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the patience and wisdom to decipher them. Justice, like a complex cable pattern, might twist and turn and seem to double back on itself, but in the end, if one followed each strand carefully, it always revealed its true design.